The last person Bob Dylan expected to find standing on his Woodstock doorstep on that gray October afternoon in 1965 was Herbert Carey, clutching a battered ukulele case and wearing a threadbare Victorian suit that looked like it had been borrowed from a museum. The 6'1" oddity everyone in Greenwich Village called Tiny Tim stood there like a lost time traveler, his long curly hair dripping with autumn rain, his enormous nose red from the cold. Dylan stared at him for a full 10 seconds before speaking. "What the hell are you doing here, Tim?" Dylan's voice carried equal parts amusement and bewilderment. The two had shared meals in the kitchen at Café Wa and crossed paths in the village clubs, but this was different. This was Dylan's private sanctuary, the retreat he'd escaped to after his motorcycle accident, the place where he was supposed to be safe from the chaos of his exploding fame. Yet here stood the most unlikely visitor imaginable, a man who belonged more in 1895 than 1965, looking at Dylan with those guileless eyes that saw the world through a lens of perpetual wonder. Tiny Tim removed his soaked hat and bowed slightly, water droplets falling from his hair onto Dylan's porch. "Oh, Mr. Dylan, God bless you. I do hope I haven't come at an inconvenient time. I was told by a mutual acquaintance that you might be willing to speak with me about the authentic nature of American folk music. I've brought some Edison cylinder recordings that I believe would interest you greatly." His voice carried that strange formal cadence that made every conversation sound like a Victorian drawing room exchange, even when conducted on the doorstep of a shack in the Catskill Mountains. Dylan looked past Tim toward the empty dirt road. No car in sight. "How did you get here?" The question carried implications beyond mere transportation. Woodstock in 1965 wasn't exactly on the hippie tourist map yet. Most people didn't even know Dylan was living there. The address was supposed to be a carefully guarded secret, known only to his closest friends and his manager Albert Grossman. Yet here was this bizarre figure from the village folk scene, dripping wet and apparently having traveled miles through the mountains to discuss the authenticity of turn-of-the-century recordings. "I walked from the train station," Tim replied matter-of-factly, as if traveling 15 miles on foot through unfamiliar mountain roads in the rain was the most natural thing in the world. A kind gentleman at the station provided directions. "I hope you don't mind my persistence, but I simply had to speak with someone who understands the true roots of our American musical heritage. I've heard you play the old songs, Mr. Dylan, and I can tell that you feel the same reverence for the authentic spirit that I do." Dylan shook his head slowly, trying to process what he was seeing and hearing. Behind him, he could hear Sarah moving around in the kitchen, probably wondering who was at the door. This was supposed to be his quiet time, his recovery period, his chance to step away from the pressures and expectations that had been building since he'd gone electric at Newport. The last thing he needed was a surprise visit from the village's most eccentric performer. But something about Tim's earnest expression, the genuine respect in his voice when he said authentic spirit, made Dylan step aside and gesture toward the interior of the house. "You walked 15 miles in the rain to talk about Edison cylinders?" Dylan asked, but he was already moving back from the doorway. "Come in before you catch pneumonia. Sarah's making coffee." As Tim stepped across the threshold, Dylan noticed the careful way he wiped his feet on the mat, the way he clutched his ukulele case protectively against his chest. There was something almost childlike about his gratitude, a quality that cut through all of Dylan's cynicism about the music business and the hangers-on who constantly sought his attention. But what happened in the next 3 hours would challenge everything both men thought they knew about musical authenticity, artistic integrity, and the strange kinship that could exist between the most unlikely of musical souls. Because Bob Dylan was about to discover that Herbert Carey possessed something that all of Dylan's success couldn't buy, a pure, uncompromised connection to the musical past that existed entirely outside the machinery of the modern music industry. The interior of Dylan's Woodstock house was spartanly furnished, with instruments scattered around the living room and books stacked on every available surface. Sarah brought coffee and quietly disappeared, leaving the two men alone. Tim sat rigidly upright on the edge of the couch, his ukulele case balanced on his knees, looking around the room with the wide-eyed appreciation of someone visiting a shrine. Dylan settled into his usual chair, studying this unexpected visitor with the intensity he usually reserved for songwriting. "So," Dylan said, lighting a cigarette and watching Tim carefully, "you wanted to talk about authentic folk music." There was skepticism in his voice, the wariness of someone who'd been lectured by purists ever since he dared to plug in an electric guitar. Dylan had been called a sellout, a betrayer of folk traditions, a commercial opportunist. The accusations had stung more than he cared to admit, and he wasn't in the mood for another lecture about musical purity from someone who performed in variety shows and sang novelty songs. Tim opened his case and pulled out a small stack of what looked like photographic copies. "Mr. Dillon, if I may, I'd like to share something that I believe will demonstrate what I mean by authentic connection to our musical heritage." He spread the papers on the coffee table with the care of someone handling religious artifacts. "These are reproductions of sheet music from the 1890s and early 1900s, not the published versions that most people know, but the original arrangements as they were first performed in medicine shows and traveling variety acts." Dillon leaned forward, genuinely curious despite himself. The papers showed handwritten musical notations, some with notes scrawled in the margins, corrections and variations that spoke of music that had been lived rather than simply composed. "Where did you get these?" Dillon asked, his tone shifting from skepticism to interest. "I've spent the last 15 years researching at the New York Public Library," Tim replied, his voice taking on the passionate intensity of a true obsessive. "I make photographic copies of anything I find. Edison cylinder recordings, sheet music, personal correspondence between performers. I've documented vocal techniques that have been completely forgotten, Mr. Dillon, ways of breathing, ways of shaping notes that died out when recording technology standardized everything." This was not what Dillon had expected. He'd assumed Tim was just another village eccentric, trading on novelty and nostalgia for cheap laughs. But the papers on his coffee table suggested something entirely different. A scholar, an archivist, someone who had dedicated his life to preserving something authentic that the modern world was in danger of losing. "Show me," Dillon said simply. Tim's face lit up with an almost religious fervor. He picked up his ukulele, tuned it quickly with the practiced efficiency of a professional musician, and began to sing. But this wasn't the high falsetto that audiences expected from Tiny Tim. This was a completely different voice, a warm baritone that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. He was singing Beautiful Dreamer, but not the Stephen Foster version that everyone knew. This was something earlier, rawer, with ornamentations and vocal techniques that made the familiar melody sound completely fresh. Dillon felt something shift inside his chest. This wasn't performance. This was transmission. Tim was channeling something that had been lost, bringing voices from the past into the present with a fidelity that went beyond mere imitation. When the song ended, Dillon sat in silence for nearly a minute, processing what he'd just heard. "That's not how anyone sings that song anymore," Dillon finally said. "No," Tim agreed, "because most people only know the published version. But I found a recording of Henry Burr singing it in 1905, before the record companies started telling artists how to standardize their performances. The original had these little catches in the voice, these moments of vulnerability that make the lyrics mean something completely different." Dillon stubbed out his cigarette and leaned back in his chair. "You're not what I thought you were, Tim." The admission came reluctantly, but Dillon had built his career on recognizing authenticity when he heard it, even when it came in unexpected packages. "Most people aren't expecting what I actually am," Tim replied with that characteristic lack of bitterness that marked everything he said. "They see the Victorian clothes and the falsetto, and they think it's an act, but Mr. Dillon, this is who I am. I've never pretended to be modern. I've never tried to fit into what people expect from contemporary music. I sing the songs that speak to me, the way they were meant to be sung, because that's the only way I know how to be authentic." The word hung in the air between them. Authenticity. It was what Dillon had been accused of abandoning when he went electric. It was what the folk purist claimed he'd sacrificed for commercial success. And here was this strange figure, this living anachronism who had somehow maintained a connection to musical authenticity that existed entirely outside the debates that were tearing the folk world apart. "The thing that kills me," Dillon said, "is that you're probably more authentic than any of us, and you're the one they call a novelty act." Tim nodded slowly. "I've never understood why wanting to preserve something beautiful makes people uncomfortable. When I sing those old songs the way they were originally performed, I can feel the spirits of the men who first sang them. Henry Burr, Irving Kaufman, Billy Murray. They weren't trying to be commercial. They were just trying to capture something true about the human experience." Dillon stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had become his refuge. "You know what's funny, Tim? I came up here to get away from all the arguments about what folk music is supposed to be. All the people telling me I'm authentic or I'm not authentic, I'm true to the tradition or I'm betraying it. And here you come, walking through the rain to show me what actual authenticity looks like." "I didn't come here to make any kind of statement, Mr. Dillon," Tim said quietly. "I came because I wanted to meet someone else who loves the old songs. Someone who understands that music is bigger than whatever decade we happen to be living in." Dillon turned away from the window. For the first time since Tim had arrived, He smiled genuinely. "You want to hear something? I've been working on some new material. Nothing like what people expect from me. Just me and the guitar, trying to get back to something, I don't know, something more essential." Tim's eyes widened with the kind of excitement usually reserved for children. "Oh, Mr. Dillon, I would be greatly honored to hear your new compositions." What followed was unlike any musical exchange either man had ever experienced. Dillon played rough versions of songs that wouldn't appear on albums for years, while Tim shared forgotten gems from the turn of the century, each performance accompanied by detailed stories about the original artists and the cultural context that shaped their work. They discovered connections between Dillon's work and the traditional ballad forms that Tim had studied, parallels that neither had noticed before. As the afternoon wore into evening, something remarkable happened. The age difference disappeared. The stylistic differences became irrelevant. Two musical obsessives found themselves speaking the same language, connected by a shared reverence for the power of song to capture human experience in all its complexity.
"You know what you are, Tim?"
Dillon said around 8 o'clock as they shared a simple dinner that Sarah had prepared. "You're an authentic musical archaeologist. You're preserving things that the rest of us don't even know we've lost." Tim blushed at the compliment, but Dillon could see that the words meant something to him. "I've never thought of myself that way, Mr. Dillon. I just sing the songs I love." "That's exactly why it matters," Dillon replied. "You're not trying to prove anything to anyone. You're not trying to make a statement about authenticity or tradition or any of that. You just love the music, and that love is what keeps it alive." As the evening deepened, Dillon found himself thinking about his own relationship to the folk tradition. He'd been so focused on pushing forward, on evolving and changing and refusing to be trapped by other people's expectations, that he'd sometimes lost sight of what had drawn him to music in the first place. Talking with Tim reminded him of the pure joy he'd felt when he first discovered Woody Guthrie records, the sense of connecting with something larger than himself. "I want to tell you something, Tim," Dillon said as they sat in the living room, both men holding guitars now. "All those people who've been giving me grief about going electric, about betraying the folk tradition, most of them don't know half what you know about actual folk music. They're protecting an idea of authenticity, not the real thing." Tim strummed a chord softly. "Perhaps they're afraid, Mr. Dillon. Fear can make people hold on to things too tightly. But music isn't meant to be held. It's meant to flow from one person to another, from one generation to the next. It's meant to change and grow while still carrying the essential truth forward." The observation was so simple, and yet it cut through all the complicated arguments about tradition and innovation that had been plaguing Dillon's career. "You really walked 15 miles in the rain to tell me that?" Tim laughed, a sound both gentle and genuine. "No, Mr. Dillon, I walked 15 miles in the rain because I hoped to learn something from you. I didn't realize you might learn something from me as well." As the night grew later, Dillon found himself sharing things he rarely discussed with anyone. The pressure of being seen as a spokesman for a generation he wasn't sure he understood. The weight of expectations from fans who wanted him to remain frozen in whatever image they preferred. The difficulty of staying true to his artistic vision when everyone had opinions about what Bob Dylan was supposed to be. "The thing is," Dillon said, "I know I'm going to keep changing. I can't help it. I hear new sounds, new possibilities, and I have to explore them. But sometimes I wonder if I'm losing something essential in the process." Tim listened with the complete attention he gave to everything, his unusual features arranged in an expression of deep sympathy. "May I ask you something, Mr. Dillon?" "Sure. When you write a song, in that moment when the words and melody come together, do you feel connected to something larger than yourself?" Dillon considered the question seriously. Yeah, I do." "Then you're still connected to the same source that inspired all the great songs from all the great eras. The forms change, the instrumentation changes, but that connection to the eternal human experience of joy and sorrow and love and loss, that remains constant." It was nearly midnight when Tim finally prepared to leave. Dillon had offered to drive him back to town, but Tim insisted he preferred to walk. "The night air will help me think about all the wonderful things you've shared with me," he said, carefully packing his ukulele. As they stood on the porch, Dillon felt an unexpected sadness about the evening ending. "Tim, I want you to know something. This conversation tonight, it's reminded me of why I started making music in the first place. Sometimes you get so caught up in the business, in the criticism, in all the external noise, that you forget about the joy of just sharing music with someone who understands." Tim extended his hand in that formal way of his. "Mr. Dillon, you've given me a great gift tonight. You've shown me that authenticity can wear many faces, that staying true to the spirit of music doesn't require staying trapped in its past forms. I shall treasure this evening always. Dylan watched the tall, strange figure disappear into the darkness, walking down the mountain road with the same purposeful stride that had brought him there. For several minutes, Dylan stood on his porch thinking about musical archaeology and authentic connections and the way pure love for music could bridge any gap between seemingly incompatible artistic visions. The next morning, Dylan woke with a new song in his head. It wouldn't be recorded for several years, and when it was, critics would debate its meaning and influences. But Dylan would always know that it had been born from a conversation with a man who understood that authenticity wasn't about maintaining rigid adherence to established forms, but about preserving the essential human truth that great music had always carried. Word of the encounter never leaked to the press. Dylan didn't talk about it in interviews, and Tim certainly wasn't the type to exploit his connection to famous musicians. But for those who knew both men well, something had shifted. Dylan's subsequent work showed a deeper understanding of traditional forms, even as he continued to push boundaries. And Tim, for his part, seemed to gain a new confidence in his own artistic vision, a sense that his preservation of forgotten musical treasures was not just nostalgic indulgence, but vital cultural work. Years later, after Tim's death, Dylan would tell an interviewer about the night an authentic musical archaeologist had walked through the mountains to his door. "He taught me something I'd been trying to figure out for years," Dylan said. "The difference between honoring tradition and being imprisoned by it. Tim understood that you could love the old music without hating the new music. He showed me that authenticity isn't about what you play or how you play it, it's about why you play it." The story became part of the mythology surrounding both artists. The night the spokesman for the counterculture and the Victorian time traveler found common ground in their shared reverence for the transformative power of song. It was a reminder that the most meaningful musical connections often happen in private moments, away from stages and studios and audiences, when two people who love music simply share what they know with each other. Tim kept a photo from that evening, taken by Sarah before he left. It shows two unlikely collaborators sitting with their guitars, Dylan in his casual clothes and Tim in his formal suit, both men smiling with the satisfaction of musical souls who had found unexpected kinship. On the back, in Tim's careful handwriting, he wrote, "The night I learned that tradition and innovation can dance together. October 15, 1965. God bless Mr. Dylan." That encounter would influence both men for the rest of their careers, though neither would speak publicly about its impact. But for anyone who understood the deep currents of American music, it represented something beautiful. Proof that authenticity comes not from rigid adherence to established forms, but from genuine love for the eternal human truths that great music has always expressed. In a world that often forced artists to choose between honoring the past and embracing the future, Bob Dylan and Tiny Tim had found a third way, the path of the true musical archaeologist, digging for treasure in the past while remaining fully alive to the possibilities of the present.